Before building the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, French sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi pitched almost the exact same giant figure to a completely different country, Egypt. In the late 1860s, inspired by the opening of the Suez Canal, Bartholdi approached Egypt's ruler, Khedive Ismail Pasha, with a design for a colossal statue of a veiled Egyptian peasant woman holding a torch or lamp aloft, meant to greet ships entering the canal and double as a lighthouse. The Khedive turned it down. The project was too expensive for a treasury that had just drained itself building the canal, and the rejected concept came back to the sculptor a few years later in new form. The same raised arm with a torch, the same colossal figure, but now not an anonymous Eastern peasant woman, instead the personification of liberty, a gift to America from the French people. Almost nobody remembers today that one of the most recognizable symbols of the United States started out as a rejected pitch for Egypt. And that's far from the only myth standing between what we think we know about France and what actually happened. Coming up, 35 stories like that, about paintings, kings, revolutions, language, food, and cities France gave the world. And what's true, and what's just a good story. Let's start with what's closest to the touristy view of the country, the art and monuments that became postcards long before anyone bothered checking their real history. Myth number 1. The Eiffel Tower was designed from the start to be a permanent symbol of Paris. In reality, the tower was built as a temporary structure for the 1889 World's Fair, with an official permit to stand for just 20 years, after which it was supposed to be dismantled for scrap. What saved it was a purely practical consideration. Its top turned out to be a convenient spot for a radio antenna, and the military quickly recognized the value of that kind of tower for long-range communication, especially heading into World War I. A sizable group of France's most prominent cultural figures, writers, artists, and architects, actually opposed the tower's design at the time, publishing an open letter calling the future structure useless and monstrous, a tragic street lamp, and a disgraceful metal skeleton disfiguring the city's look. Engineer Gustave Eiffel himself built a small private apartment on the top floor, where he hosted distinguished guests, including Thomas Edison. Today, that space is preserved as a museum exhibit, complete with wax figures recreating one of those visits. Building the tower took a little over 2 years and, remarkably, resulted in 0 worker fatalities, an outstanding safety record for a project of that scale in the late 19th century, largely thanks to Eiffel's own personal insistence on protecting his workers. After the initial 20-year permit expired, the tower's existence kept getting extended, and the question of demolishing it finally stopped coming up once it became clear that dismantling a metal structure like that would cost just as much as maintaining it. Today, the tower draws millions of visitors every year and remains the most visited paid monument in the world. And its iron frame gets hand repainted every few years by teams of high-altitude climbers, since no automated painting method has ever been deemed reliable enough for a structure like this. The tower itself has actually changed shades of paint several times since it was built, including different yellow-brown and bronze tones, before engineers settled on the current signature color, specifically engineered to visually compensate for perspective and appear evenly colored from below, even though the upper levels are actually painted a noticeably lighter tone than the lower ones. The annual ceremony of lighting thousands of twinkling lights on the tower after dark, one of Paris's signature nighttime tourist spectacles, is technically protected by copyright on the light display itself, meaning commercial photography and publication of those nighttime shots technically requires permission. Myth number 2. The Mona Lisa was always considered the Louvre's crown jewel and the most famous artwork in the world. The painting actually only became truly world famous fairly late, largely thanks to its own theft from the museum in 1911. The thief turned out to be a former Louvre employee of Italian descent who kept the painting hidden in the false bottom of a wooden trunk in his Paris apartment for almost 2 years before trying to sell it to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, claiming he was patriotically returning Leonardo da Vinci's work to the artist's homeland. The theft wasn't discovered right away. Museum staff spent almost a full day assuming the painting had simply been taken away for photography. Among the temporary suspects in the case was a young, not yet famous Pablo Picasso, questioned by police over his indirect connection to other stolen Louvre items through a mutual acquaintance. Today, the painting is displayed behind bulletproof glass in a special climate-controlled case, a direct, still active legacy of that very theft. The painting's return to France was later staged as a genuine national celebration, with cheering crowds greeting it all along its route back through the country. And the whole detective story of the theft, paradoxically, did far more for the painting's world fame than several previous centuries of quietly hanging in the Louvre's galleries. Today, the museum's own estimates put the average time a typical visitor spends actually looking at the painting at just a few dozen seconds before the crowd sweeps them along, a rare case of a museum's most famous exhibit getting less attention than its own theft story. The painting's fairly modest actual size is also a regular source of mild disappointment for first-time viewers, used to seeing it blown up in countless reproductions, an effect common to a number of other world-famous artworks whose cultural significance in the popular imagination has long since stopped matching their real physical scale. Myth number 3. The Louvre was always a public museum, open to anyone. The former royal palace only became a public museum in the middle of the French Revolution in 1793, when the revolutionary government nationalized the royal art collection. The famous glass pyramid in the courtyard, designed by Chinese-American architect I.M. Pei and opened in the late 1980s, initially sparked just as much outraged debate as the Eiffel Tower once had, before becoming an inseparable part of the museum's look. During both World Wars, the museum's most valuable pieces, including the Mona Lisa itself, were hastily evacuated to remote provincial chateaux under the direction of French museums director Jacques Jaujard, who personally organized the collection's movement between several hiding spots, specifically to confuse any potential looters. The Louvre's collection keeps growing today through state acquisitions and private donations, remaining a living, not frozen collection. Before becoming an art museum, the building itself served for centuries, first as a fortress, then a royal residence, and only later a cultural institution. Archaeological digs conducted under the museum during the glass pyramid's construction uncovered the foundations of the very first 12th century medieval fortress, now open for viewing right in the museum's basement galleries. The Louvre draws more visitors annually than any other art museum on the planet, and its total exhibition space is so vast that, by guides' rough estimates, giving even a few seconds' glance to every single piece on display would take a visitor several straight days in the galleries. A large part of the Louvre's modern wing, including the underground spaces beneath the famous glass pyramid, was built using engineering solutions considered innovative at the time, allowing for additional exhibition and service space without compromising the historic look of the palace complex above ground, and the pyramid itself, at architect I.M. Pei's personal insistence, was made from special ultra-clear, low-iron glass to avoid the greenish tint typical of ordinary building glass. The number of individual glass panels making up the pyramid, contrary to a popular urban legend claiming exactly 666 panels, a number associated with devilish symbolism, actually noticeably exceeds that superstitious figure, which hasn't stopped the myth from circulating for years among certain conservative-minded Parisians who were skeptical of a modern glass structure appearing next to the historic palace in the first place. Myth number 4. Notre Dame Cathedral has survived to this day exactly as medieval builders constructed it. The familiar look of the cathedral, including its famous spire and many decorative gargoyles, was actually only added in the 19th century during a massive restoration by architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. and it was that later spire that burned to the ground in the catastrophic 2019 fire. During the revolution, the cathedral was ransacked. An enraged mob beheaded the statues of biblical kings on the facade, mistaking them for French monarchs, and the building itself was used for a time as a warehouse for storing grain. Interest in Gothic architecture, fueled in large part by Victor Hugo's novel, restored the cathedral's status as a national shrine and kicked off the 19th century restoration campaign. The 2019 fire destroyed the historic wooden roof frame, which the French called the forest for using the timber of so many individual trees, but the restoration, deliberately carried out using medieval carpentry techniques, wrapped up far faster than skeptics predicted. Construction of the cathedral in its original form stretched across nearly 2 centuries, from the mid-12th to the mid-14th century, which is why its look combines several successive stages of Gothic architecture's development, distinguishable to a trained eye even without formal art history training. A few days before the 2019 fire, the copper statues of the apostles and evangelists topping that wooden spire were prudently removed for planned inspection and restoration as part of already underway repair work. A lucky break that let those sculptures survive, even though the spire beneath them burned to the ground just days later. The investigation into the fire's cause never established a single, definitively proven origin. Weighing among the leading theories both an accidental electrical short circuit and an unextinguished cigarette from one of the workers on the ongoing restoration project, leaving the root cause of one of the most talked-about cultural disasters of modern times formally unresolved to this day. Myth number 5. The Statue of Liberty is purely an American symbol, with no real connection to France itself. As mentioned at the start, the statue was designed by French sculptor Bartholdi, with the internal metal framework engineered by Gustave Eiffel. Built in France, it was shipped across the ocean in pieces and given to the United States by the French people as a token of friendship between the two republics. Funds for the pedestal in America had to be raised through a separate, fairly relentless public donation campaign, since Congress wasn't in any hurry to allocate government funding. Far less known is the smaller replica facing its New York big sister, standing in Paris itself on a small artificial island in the Seine, a gift from the American community to the French capital a few years after the original was installed. The plaque bearing the sonnet by American poet Emma Lazarus, opening with the line, "Give me your tired, your poor," wasn't added to the statue's pedestal until 2 decades after the monument's official opening, and wasn't originally seen as an integral part of the design at all. Today, those lines are firmly associated with the statue's whole symbolism as a beacon for immigrants. Shipping the statue, disassembled into several hundred individual pieces across the Atlantic, required a specially chartered French naval vessel, and the final assembly of the Colossus on site in New York Harbor took American engineers several months of painstaking work, fitting the copper skin panels to the internal metal framework Eiffel had designed. An engineering task comparable in complexity to building a major bridge of that era. Funding for the pedestal in America was largely secured thanks to a massive newspaper campaign by one New York publisher, who personally called on ordinary, far from wealthy readers to donate even small amounts, promising in return to publish every single donor's name in his paper, regardless of the size of their gift. A technique that could fairly be called one of the first genuinely mass crowdfunding campaigns in history. Myth number 6. Closing out the block on art and monuments. France keeps its cultural heritage exclusively in a handful of major Parisian museums. Beyond the Louvre and other capital city collections, the country has one of the most extensive networks of regional art museums in the world, and the decentralized Louvre Lent program, which opened a branch of the country's main museum in a former mining region in northern France in 2012, was a deliberate attempt to make cultural heritage less concentrated purely in the capital. A similar approach was later extended to other institutions, including a regional branch of the Pompidou Center, pointing to a consistent state policy of cultural decentralization. Beyond major branches of capital museums, Practically every reasonably significant French town has its own municipal fine arts museum, often holding a genuinely serious European painting collection assembled back in the 19th century by local patrons and industrialists, which makes exposure to French visual art possible well outside the usual tourist route through the capital's gallery. The state program of transferring artworks from central Parisian storage to regional museums has existed for more than 2 centuries. As far back as the early 19th century, a large share of church and aristocratic collections confiscated during the Revolution were deliberately distributed to provincial towns, laying the groundwork for today's surprisingly rich, by world standards, artistic heritage, even in comparatively small French towns that never made it onto the country's traditional tourist circuit.
The annual nationwide European Heritage Days event, during which many historic buildings and private collections normally closed to the public open their doors for free for 1 weekend a year, was actually invented in France in the mid-1980s and only later grew into a Europe-wide event now held in several dozen countries across the continent. We've covered art. Now on to the second theme, France's colonial past and how it continues to shape the country in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Myth number 7. The French colonial empire was relatively modest in scale compared to other European colonial powers. At its peak, the French colonial empire was the second largest by territory in the world after the British, spanning huge areas of North and West Africa, Indochina, the Caribbean islands, and the Pacific. The empire's final retreat came with extremely painful conflicts, including the Algerian War of Independence, which claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and defeat in Indochina, which buried French colonial ambitions in Southeast Asia long before the far better-known American War in Vietnam. Official French assimilation policy theoretically promised legal equality between colonial subjects and citizens of mainland France, though in practice, this remained accessible only to a narrow circle of the local colonial elite. Tellingly, the widespread use of French across multiple continents, from West Africa to Indochina, remains a significant tool of modern French international influence. And the International Organization of La Francophonie brings together dozens of states specifically on the basis of a shared colonial linguistic heritage, regardless of their current political relations with the former colonial power. It's also telling that, by total number of speakers, France, or even Europe as a whole, is no longer the confident leader in French speakers today. That title belongs to the African continent, where French remains the language of education and government administration in a number of former colonies. And demographers, based on the region's current population growth rates, project a further, quite substantial rise in the share of French-speaking Africans among all speakers of the language worldwide in the coming decades. Independent African states' own attitude toward the colonial French legacy remains far from uniform. Alongside French's continued presence in education systems across former colonies, recent years have seen growing public movements against continued use of the so-called African franc, a regional currency whose issuance has historically been controlled by the French treasury,
seen by part of the local population as an inherited, still unresolved mechanism of colonial-era economic dependency. The Algerian War of Independence itself remains one of the most taboo subjects in French public consciousness, even decades after it ended. The French army's use of torture against Algerian rebels remained a matter of deliberate state silence for a long time, with official acknowledgement of specific cases only coming from French leadership fairly recently, making this chapter of colonial history far less processed in public memory than the more distant events of World War II. An official state day of remembrance for victims of the war in Algeria and those who died in Tunisia and Morocco was only established in France in 2012, exactly 50 years after the agreements ending the conflict were signed, which itself speaks volumes about how long both French society and the state remained unready for this kind of symbolic, official acknowledgement. A major wave of French settlers repatriating from Algeria after independence was declared also left a deep mark on France's own internal demographics and political life, as hundreds of thousands of so-called pieds noirs were forced to essentially rebuild their lives from scratch on mainland French soil, often facing a wary, sometimes openly hostile reception from the local population, adding one more difficult layer to an already complicated public reckoning with the outcomes of decolonization. A separate, no less painful chapter of that same war involves the fate of Algerians who fought on the French army's side, known as Harkis. After independence was declared, many faced brutal reprisals back home, and some of those who managed to make it to France were housed for decades in temporary camps under genuinely harsh conditions, which became the subject of a separate official state acknowledgement and apology only in the 21st century. Descendants of the Harkis, raised in France, faced their own distinct integration struggles for decades, caught in a fairly unusual position between two societies, seen by part of the French population as Algerians and by part of the Algerian population as traitors. They long remained a community whose story didn't fit neatly into either country's ready-made narrative.
Myth number 8. During World War II, France was under a single, fully uniform German occupation administration. After the 1940 defeat, the territory was split into several zones, including the German-occupied northern and western part of the country, and a formally independent but effectively collaborationist government under Marshal Pétain in the south, based in the town of Vichy. Post-war France spent decades preferring to downplay the real scale of collaboration with the occupiers, cultivating a myth of near-universal national participation in the resistance, and only officially acknowledged state responsibility in 1995 in a statement by President Jacques Chirac. Marshal Pétain himself, considered a national hero in the interwar period for defending Verdun in World War I, was sentenced to death for treason after France's liberation, a sentence later commuted to life imprisonment. A significant share of the actual on-the-ground execution of German orders, including the infamous roundups of Paris's Jewish population, fell to French police and administrative bodies operating under the Vichy government, which makes the extent of institutional involvement by the French state apparatus in occupation-era crimes an especially painful and still not fully resolved subject of public reckoning. A significant portion of France's pre-war and wartime Jewish community managed to avoid deportation thanks to ordinary citizens who hid neighbors and acquaintances at risk of their own lives, and entire villages, the most famous located in a mountainous region in the south of the country, organized and systematically hid hundreds of refugees throughout the occupation, later earning official international recognition for their collective courage. Much of the resistance movement itself initially operated in scattered, often unconnected small groups of varying political orientation, from committed communists to conservative Catholics and monarchist military officers. And it was only later that General de Gaulle managed to achieve relative unification of this extremely diverse movement under a single political leadership operating from exile. De Gaulle's own symbolic status as leader of the resistance stood in noticeable contrast to his fairly modest actual influence over combat operations inside occupied France in the war's early years. And his authority as a leader recognized by all factions came together gradually, through persistent diplomatic work with the Allies and other resistance groups, rather than being obvious from the very first day of his famous radio address to the French from London in June 1940. Myth number 9. The metric system was invented and instantly, universally adopted throughout France right after it appeared in the late 18th century. Introducing the metric system actually met serious resistance both from ordinary people used to older local units of measurement and part of the merchant class, and the full transition stretched over several decades. The initial expedition to precisely measure the length of the Paris meridian, needed to calculate the standard meter, took place under extremely difficult political conditions of the Revolutionary era, including the arrest of one of the scientists leading the measurements on suspicion of espionage. The final measurement later turned out to be slightly inaccurate due to a small calculational error, which is why the modern meter differs by a tiny fraction from the originally intended 1/10 millionth of the distance from the pole to the equator. Alongside the metric system of weights and measures, the revolutionary government also tried introducing decimal time, a day of 10 hours, each divided into 100 minutes, each of those into 100 seconds. But this far more radical reform never caught on even in France, and was officially scrapped within a few years, surviving today only as an amusing curiosity on a handful of surviving decimal clocks in museum collections. Even though the metric system, in one form or another, is officially recognized by nearly every country in the world today, the United States remains one of the rare exceptions, still using miles, pounds, and Fahrenheit, inherited from the British Empire in everyday life. NASA has, at one point,
Officially cited confusion specifically between metric and imperial units as one reason behind the loss of an expensive interplanetary probe. A cautionary tale for engineers worldwide about the practical risks of two different measurement systems coexisting in critical technical calculations. The metric system also added a far more modest, everyday innovation to French life, dividing the country's currency into 100 smaller decimal units, something that feels self-evident today but was, at the time, just as deliberate a rationalist reform as switching to decimal units of length and weight. Myth number 10. The European Union was founded purely on French initiative, with no meaningful input from other countries. French statesman Robert Schuman and the declaration he proposed in 1950 genuinely played a foundational role in launching European integration, but the process was, from the very start, built as a Franco-German partnership, meant to rule out any future military conflict by pooling coal and steel production. The Schuman Declaration was announced on May 9, 1950, with virtually no prior public discussion even within the French government itself, and its text was kept secret until the last moment to avoid resistance from industrial interests, which is why May 9th is now celebrated as Europe Day. The first meeting of representatives from the founding countries, held to finalize the treaty's terms, took place in an atmosphere of significant diplomatic tension and mutual distrust, entirely understandable given that only about 5 years had passed since the end of a devastating war between those exact same countries, which makes reaching any such agreement all the more remarkable. A post-war reconciliation precedent. French voters, though, haven't always supported further integration. In a 2005 referendum, they rejected a proposed EU constitution, a serious shock to supporters of a federalist future. Only 6 founding states joined the original European coal and steel community in 1951, including France itself, West Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries. And it took decades of successive expansions for what became the EU to grow to several dozen member states. France's own switch to the single European currency in the early 2000s was also accompanied by noticeable nostalgia for the old franc among part of the population, giving rise to the lasting colloquial expression old franc, which older French people still sometimes use today to mentally recalculate the prices of new goods back into the currency they grew up with. The actual physical exchange of old franc notes and coins for the new currency also stretched on far longer than in most other Eurozone countries. The country's central bank kept accepting old banknotes for exchange for several decades after the official switch to the euro, reflecting exactly that sentimental attachment a large share of the population held for the old national currency. Myth number 11. Closing out the block on colonies in the 20th century. The French Foreign Legion has historically only accepted criminal fugitives fleeing justice. The Legion really did offer enlisted foreigners the option to serve under an assumed name, something occasionally used by people wanting a fresh start. But modern recruitment involves fairly strict identity and criminal background checks. The tradition of official anonymity upon enlistment was introduced mainly to protect the interests of foreign nationals whose service in another country's armed forces could carry legal consequences back home. Every year on April 30th, the Legion marks Cameroon Day, honoring an 1863 battle in Mexico, And completing service traditionally grants an accelerated path to French citizenship through a process informally called becoming French by spilled blood. Recruits spend their first years of service required to undergo all their basic training exclusively in French, regardless of their original nationality or language level upon joining, which has made intensive language immersion an effectively integral, if unofficial, part of the unit's combat training. The Legion's emblem, featuring a flaming grenade, and its motto, "The Legion is our homeland," underscore the idea that for an enlisted foreigner, the unit itself, rather than any specific country of origin, becomes the primary object of military loyalty from that point forward. The Legion's distinctive, slow, deliberately measured parade march, strikingly different from the far brisker marching pace of the rest of the French army, is, by one account,
originally adapted to moving through deep desert sand during colonial campaigns in North Africa, and today survives purely as a recognizable ceremonial tradition, displayed to the public every year during the National Holiday Parade. Beyond ground infantry units, the Legion historically also had its own cavalry and, later, paratrooper units, which took part in a number of post-war armed conflicts involving France, including the wars in Indochina and Algeria, making the unit's history far more varied in the kinds of combat roles it's played than the popular image of a purely infantry force fighting in the deserts of North Africa. We've covered the colonial past. Time to move to a theme France is unimaginable without: food and gastronomic culture. Myth number 12. The croissant is an originally French invention. The croissant is believed to have descended from the Austrian Kipferl, tied to a legend about victory over the Turks during the Siege of Vienna, and reached France either with the Austrian Princess Marie Antoinette or via Viennese bakeries that opened in Paris in the 19th century. The modern laminated technique, using yeasted dough, was developed by French bakers themselves, effectively creating a new dish based on a borrowed idea.
Pain au chocolat belongs to that same Viennese category of pastry, and by French tradition, the difference between a croissant made with pure butter and a cheaper margarine version is marked by shape. Straight tips versus curved. The modern layered dough structure, requiring repeated rolling and folding with layers of cold butter in between, only took shape in French bakeries in the early 20th century, meaning noticeably later than the croissant's own appearance as a dish, and the technique of properly tempering butter for laminated dough,
requiring precise temperature control at every stage of rolling, remained, before modern industrial refrigeration, a skill accessible only to the most experienced bakers, which partly explains why a truly well-made croissant long remained more of a rare delicacy than an everyday item. And making genuinely good laminated dough is still considered by professional pastry chefs one of the most labor-intensive, years-in-the-making skills in all of baking. The annual national competition for the country's best croissant, alongside a similar one for baguettes, has become a notable professional and media event in recent decades, drawing attention from both industry experts and ordinary pastry lovers. And bakeries that win these competitions often see a real boost in new customers purely from the recognition itself. Annual croissant consumption in France remains high enough that, for most local bakeries, it's considered a morning ritual, not the festive treat foreign tourists often see it as. Myth number 13. The Michelin star system was originally conceived as a purely culinary award. The system, today the globally recognized gold standard of restaurant ratings, was actually originally conceived as a marketing tool for a tire manufacturer, aiming to encourage road trips around the country by publishing a guide recommending restaurants and hotels. The first guide was distributed free and included not just restaurant recommendations, but tire-changing tips. The star rating system only appeared several decades later. The process of awarding stars is shrouded in strict secrecy. Inspectors' identities are never publicly disclosed, and a restaurant losing a previously awarded star can trigger a genuine professional crisis for its chef. The guide's top award, the third star,
is granted to only a few dozen restaurants worldwide at any given time, making it one of the rarest professional honors in any field. And earning, and especially holding on to, that status often requires a restaurant to completely restructure its entire operating model, including noticeably cutting seating capacity in favor of longer, more attentive service for each individual guest.
Some renowned chefs have, over the years, even voluntarily given up already awarded stars, publicly stating that the system forces them to cook to please anonymous inspectors rather than pursue their own creative vision. Beyond stars, the Michelin Guide also awards the far less prestigious but no less beloved by the French Bib Gourmand category, marking restaurants with great food at an affordable price, named after the company's mascot figure made of tires, making this category a kind of democratic counterweight to expensive starred restaurants.
The annual publication of the updated restaurant list is accompanied in France by a genuine media frenzy, comparable in intensity to announcing the results of a major sports award, and the moment new star recipients are officially announced, gets covered by trade press practically in real time. A fairly unusual level of public attention for what's formally a modest industry directory. Some restaurants that lost a star after holding it for years have, in rare but widely covered cases, even taken the company to court, demanding an explanation for the decision,
though the company has consistently refused to provide detailed reasoning, citing the fundamental anonymity and independence of its inspection methodology. Some famous chefs have subsequently publicly admitted that constant anxiety over possibly losing a star weighed on their mental health for years of their career, contributing, over the past decade, to a more open, sympathetic public conversation about the psychological cost paid by figures in the elite restaurant industry for this kind of recognition. The guide itself has long since stopped being a purely French publication, today publishing separate regional editions annually for dozens of cities and countries around the world, including major Asian megacities, turning what started as a local marketing booklet for French motorists into a full-fledged global institution of culinary evaluation. It's also telling that before the restaurant section existed, the guide spent its first several decades including far more practically useful early 20th century motoring content, including detailed road maps, gas station locations, and even instructions for fixing common breakdowns. Content that today looks like a stark contrast to the guide's purely culinary modern reputation. The company's mascot logo itself, the recognizable figure made entirely of white tires, first appeared at international industrial expos long before it became associated with the restaurant guide, making the emblem a far older and more universal part of the company's branding than the culinary side of its business. Today, a guide's presence in a particular city or region can noticeably affect the local economy, since earning even one star often leads to a rapid rise in tourist traffic and hotel booking prices nearby, turning anonymous inspectors' decisions into a factor with impact reaching well beyond the narrow restaurant industry. And local authorities in certain regions even openly lobby for closer inspector attention to their own territory, treating culinary recognition as a full-fledged tool of regional economic policy alongside more traditional forms of tourism and small business support. Myth number 14. The French drink wine in huge quantities, far more than they used to. In reality, wine consumption in France has been steadily declining for decades, especially among young people, and the French wine industry faces growing competition from New World wines. The famous 1855 classification of Bordeaux wines, ordered by Napoleon III, has remained practically unchanged for about 170 years, undergoing correction just once. In 1973, one estate achieved the exceedingly rare feat of raising its own status after decades of persistent effort. French youth today are also noticeably more likely to prefer hard liquor and beer over wine, a source of concern for both winemakers and public health officials, though for opposite reasons. One worries about the industry's economic future, the other about young people's overall alcohol consumption.
State policy on alcohol advertising remains among the strictest in Europe. A law restricting advertising for wine and other spirits was passed back in the late 1980s and has significantly complicated marketing ever since,
even for the country's oldest, most prestigious wine houses within the domestic market. French winemaking's export orientation, meanwhile, keeps growing year after year. A significant and steadily rising share of wine produced in France, especially among the most prestigious and expensive labels, is intended not for the domestic French market at all, but for sale abroad, primarily to the United States and East Asia, where demand for prestigious French vintages among wealthy collectors keeps rising steadily, despite the overall decline in wine consumption within France itself.
Climate change is also noticeably affecting the industry. Earlier, hotter harvest seasons are forcing some famous winemaking regions to gradually experiment with grape varieties previously associated with much more southern, warmer territories. And some experts already predict that the map of traditional French wines could look noticeably different within a few decades compared to today's familiar regional classification. Winemakers in the country's northern regions, whose climate was once considered too cold and unstable for quality winemaking, have in recent years begun experimenting with planting vines where, a generation ago, the idea would have simply looked unprofitable. Slowly but noticeably shifting the geography of French winemaking toward more northern latitudes.
Myth number 15. Any sparkling wine can, by definition, be called champagne, regardless of where it's produced. Under French and broader EU protected designation law, the name champagne is legally reserved exclusively for sparkling wine produced by a specific method in the Champagne region. The region has, for decades, run persistent international campaigns to protect the name, successfully banning its use even for products that aren't wine at all, including perfume. The secondary in-bottle fermentation technique underlying champagne production, according to certain historical documents,
was actually used by English winemakers even before it began being systematically applied in the Champagne region itself. Sparkling wine from Champagne was, historically, more of an accidental byproduct than a deliberate invention. The region's cold climate often paused fermentation before winter arrived, and with the warmth of spring, the process resumed inside an already corked bottle, producing unpredictable pressure that caused many bottles to simply explode in the cellars, a phenomenon regional winemakers dubbed the devil's wine, before they learned to control the process, and turned what was once an annoying defect into the drink's signature feature. The specialized profession responsible today for the gradual, weeks-long turning of bottles at a precise angle to properly settle the sediment before final disgorgement is still largely performed by hand by experienced craftspeople at the region's most prestigious wineries, though large industrial producers long ago switched to automated versions of that same process, originally developed back in the 19th century. The aging period a finished sparkling wine must legally spend on its sediment before release must, by law, run no less than 15 months for standard non-vintage champagne and no less than 3 years for more prestigious vintage varieties. And, in practice, the region's leading houses often voluntarily age their own product significantly longer than the legal minimum, considering extended aging one of the main factors behind the complexity and depth of the final flavor.
Myth number 16. France produces an exact, unchanging number of cheese varieties. The famous line attributed to President Charles de Gaulle about the impossibility of governing a country with several hundred kinds of cheese is often quoted with different numbers and different retellings, and the real count of officially recognized and artisanal varieties keeps shifting year to year. A significant share of traditional French cheese is still made from unpasteurized milk, which sometimes creates friction with EU-wide health regulations. Eats more cheese than residents of practically any other country, and the cheese course remains a ritualized part of a meal's structure, served between the main course and dessert. Some of the varieties most prized by local food lovers, especially among soft cheeses with a pronounced pungent smell, are completely banned from the cabins of passenger aircraft under a number of airlines' existing sanitary rules, which periodically leads to amusing conflicts between French travelers trying to bring their favorite cheese abroad and transportation security staff.
Granting official protected designation of origin status to a whole range of famous French cheeses, including Roquefort and Camembert, means in practice that legally producing cheese under that specific name is only allowed in a strictly defined geographic region and using a strictly defined traditional method, right down to the breed of goat or cow whose milk is permitted. Legal protection just as strict as the kind applied to famous French wines. The annual decline in the number of small family farms specializing specifically in these traditional, protected origin cheeses is a growing concern for industry experts, who warn of the risk of gradually losing certain rare recipes tied to one narrow locality, as younger generations of farming families increasingly opt for more profitable, less labor-intensive forms of agriculture over the cheese-making craft inherited from their ancestors.
Myth number 17. Closing the food block. The baguette is a product free of any government regulation whatsoever.
In fact, producing a traditional French baguette is regulated by law right down to the ingredients. A 1993 decree established that only flour, water, salt, and yeast, with no additional additives or preservatives, could be used for a baguette to be called traditional. The annual competition for the best baguette in Paris determines which bakery gets to officially supply bread to the president's residence for the following year.
And the word boulangerie is legally protected and can only be used by establishments that bake their bread on site. In 2022, the French baguette was added to UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage, and the push for this recognition actually came from bakers and culinary experts themselves, not the state. French society's historical sensitivity to the price of bread specifically dates back to the pre-revolutionary era, when sharp spikes in its cost repeatedly sparked mass unrest, including the famous March of Parisian Women on Versailles in 1789.
And that historical memory partly explains why the state still considers it necessary to regulate the composition and quality of such a symbolically loaded product today. In rural areas of France, where small bakeries are gradually closing due to staff shortages, automated vending machines selling fresh baguettes around the clock have become increasingly common in recent years, sparking a mixed reaction from locals, who appreciate the convenience of these machines while mourning the disappearance of a traditional neighborhood bakery. The baker's profession, meanwhile, remains one of the few craft trades in France officially requiring years of apprenticeship and a state qualification exam to earn the right to call one's own baking traditional, making the profession a far more formalized and legally regulated field than you might assume looking at a modest neighborhood bakery sign. Competition from large supermarkets, which have started offering their own baked goods at significantly lower prices, has noticeably reshaped the country's bread market structure in recent decades,
forcing many independent family bakeries either to close entirely or, on the contrary, lean into deliberately traditional artisanal quality as their sole competitive edge over the cheaper but less authentic offerings from chain stores. The average French shopper, per industry surveys, visits a bakery almost daily, making the neighborhood boulangerie a far more significant social institution than just a place to buy bread, a spot for brief daily chats with neighbors, and an almost ritual part of the morning or evening routine. We've covered food. Now on to identity. Language, symbols, and what the French consider the foundation of their own national culture. Myth number 18. The French language has, throughout the country's history, been a single, universally spoken means of communication for all French people. According to a survey conducted on behalf of the revolutionary government by Abbé Grégoire in the late 18th century, only a minority of the country's population actually spoke literary French fluently, while the rest spoke numerous regional languages and dialects, Occitan, Breton, Alsatian German, and dozens of others.
It was the revolutionary and subsequent Republican state that deliberately
and sometimes fairly harshly promoted a unified French language through the education system, aiming to erase regional differences in the name of national unity. And some of these regional languages survive, albeit weakened, to this day. Republican education for most of the 20th century openly punished schoolchildren for using their native regional language on school grounds, including humiliating public shaming practices, leaving a deep, painful mark on the historical memory of entire regions of the country, including Brittany and Occitania. Only in recent decades has state policy toward regional languages noticeably softened. Some can now be studied as electives in the school curriculum, and some French-language TV channels set aside a small amount of airtime for programming in regional languages, though the number of active speakers keeps steadily shrinking with each new generation. Beyond mainland regional languages, France's overseas territories add a whole range of Creole languages to the country's overall linguistic picture, formed during the colonial era from French vocabulary combined with local African or Caribbean grammatical structures. And some of these, including Haitian Creole outside France itself, now hold their own official status and a full-fledged literary tradition. Myth number 19. The Académie Française is a conservative but absolutely effective guardian of language purity, whose decisions society follows without question. The Académie is limited to 40 lifetime elected members, traditionally called the Immortals, in distinctive green embroidered uniforms and ceremonial swords. But the institution's real influence on living spoken language is far more modest than its solemn status suggests. The attempt to officially establish a French equivalent for the borrowed word le week-end never
came close to widespread success in most French people's everyday speech. The first woman wasn't elected to the Académie until 1980, more than 3.5 centuries after the institution was founded. The Académie's main official project remains its own standard dictionary of the French language, work on the current 9th edition of which has stretched across several decades and still isn't fully complete, making the Académie, per some critics' pointed remarks, an institution whose pace of work sometimes lags even behind the living language it's meant to document and protect. Beyond the dictionary, the Académie also periodically issues official recommendations for replacing specific English loanwords with French alternatives, a significant share of them concerning technology and digital vocabulary, including persistent, if not always successful, attempts to promote local terms over the now widely established English borrowings in internet and computing terminology. Myth number 20. La Marseillaise has continuously served as France's official national anthem since it was written. Written in 1792 as a battle song for the Revolutionary Army, La Marseillaise was repeatedly banned over the following century and a half. It wasn't used under Napoleon, was banned again during the Bourbon Restoration, and the collaborationist Vichy regime significantly restricted its public performance. The melody was written by military engineer Rouget de Lille in a single night in Strasbourg on the occasion of the declaration of war against Austria. And the song got its current name thanks to volunteers from Marseille who sang it on their way to fight in Paris. A fairly random origin for the geographic name of a national anthem. There's also a far less known, rarely performed children's verse of the anthem, written somewhat later than the main text specifically for school children to sing, noticeably softer in tone and stripped of the direct calls to bloodshed found in the main canonical version of the song. Beyond France itself, the melody of La Marseillaise has, at various points in history, been borrowed and adapted for their own political needs by revolutionary and protest movements in a number of other countries, turning what was originally a purely French battle song into a kind of international musical symbol of popular uprising against unjust authority, recognizable well beyond the French-speaking world. Myth number 21. The French tricolor is an ancient national symbol, tracing back to deep medieval antiquity. The flag, actually appeared during the Revolution as a compromise between the white of the Bourbon monarchy and the blue and red of the city of Paris, with the combination reportedly proposed by the Marquis de Lafayette. The flag only got its equal three-stripe proportions under Napoleon III. Before that, various tricolor versions existed with unequal stripe widths. The French flag subsequently served as a direct model for the tricolors of a number of other
countries that adopted similar revolutionary symbolism. Under the First Empire, army banners and standards often used other, far more ornate heraldic compositions with eagles and monograms, and today's familiar strict three-stripe design only became firmly established as the sole official state symbol under later republican regimes, replacing the earlier imperial and monarchist variety of flags and standards that changed with every shift in the country's political system. The flag's three colors also received different official ideological interpretations at various points in history.
While white originally symbolized the monarchy, and blue-red the city of Paris and the Revolution, a later, far more abstract interpretation, detached from the specific historical circumstances, eventually linked the flag's colors to the Republican triptych, liberty, equality, fraternity. Though this reading emerged significantly later than the flag's creation and wasn't part of the original revolutionary intent. Using the French tricolor as a political symbol also isn't always seen unambiguously positively within the country today. Certain political movements have, over recent decades, periodically tried to more actively appropriate state symbols for their own purposes, sparking public debate over the acceptable limits of using the national flag in party campaigning versus its neutral state status.
Myth number 22. Marianne, the female symbol of the French Republic, is an ancient image dating back to pre-revolutionary times. The image of Marianne as the allegorical embodiment of the Republic actually emerged during the Revolutionary era at the end of the 18th century, and the tradition of modeling her face on currently living famous French women developed relatively recently. Sculpted busts over the decades have been modeled on women like Brigitte Bardot, Catherine Deneuve, and Laetitia Casta.
The Phrygian cap on her head references the headgear of freed slaves in ancient Rome and symbolizes liberty won through struggle, though this historical subtext is already unfamiliar to a good many French people today. Busts of Marianne are a mandatory feature in every municipal government office across the country, and under the Vichy regime, the Marianne symbol was actually removed from town halls for a time, as too closely tied to the revolutionary and republican tradition, rather than the conservative state tradition the collaborationist government was trying to cultivate.
A rare example of a national symbol temporarily falling out of favor in its own country. The official state logo of the French Republic, used today on government ministry letterheads and official documents, is no longer a sculpted image of Marianne herself, but a stylized profile designed in the late 20th century by a graphic designer specially commissioned for the task, making the process of updating France's visual state identity just as carefully considered an undertaking as picking the next celebrity for a sculpted bust. The custom of choosing a currently living celebrity as the model for a Marianne bust isn't actually a strict rule set in official law, but rather an informal tradition that took hold in the mid-20th century, which is why some municipalities occasionally deliberately depart from it, choosing a less recognizable or entirely fictional model for their own version of the bust to avoid the inevitable political disputes around any specific celebrity. Myth number 23. Closing the block on identity, France is an ethnically homogeneous country, and its diversity is a recent phenomenon. The French state, as a matter of principle, doesn't collect official statistics on citizens' ethnic origin, considering that kind of tracking incompatible with the Republican principle of equality before the law regardless of origin, which makes the whole framing of ethnic homogeneity statistically meaningless in a legal sense. The multi-ethnic composition of the French national soccer team that won the 1998 World Cup became, for many, a vivid symbol of this diversity. Meanwhile, the Overseas Department of French Guiana, part of France exactly the same as any European region of the country, borders Brazil and Suriname in South America, And thanks to territories like this, France holds the world's second-largest exclusive economic maritime zone, behind only the United States. A significant share of the population of these overseas departments, though, periodically expresses genuine frustration over real economic inequality with mainland France, including noticeably higher costs of living and recurring shortages of basic goods, which occasionally boils over into large-scale protests and general strikes, calling into question the official image of complete, unconditional legal equality between overseas territories and the rest of the country. Transportation links between mainland France and its overseas departments also remain noticeably more expensive and slower than comparable distance flights within the European continent itself, which, in practice, creates a far more tangible barrier to full participation in the rest of the country's life for residents of these territories than their formerly equal civil and political status would suggest. The official state position on ethnic and religious statistics is also regularly the subject of fierce debate among sociologists and demographers. Some insist that the lack of such tracking makes it impossible to objectively measure the real scale of discrimination based on origin, while others consider the principled refusal to classify citizens this way a crucial safeguard against institutionally entrenching ethnic distinctions at the state level.
The Republican principle, under which the state officially recognizes only individual citizens, not any collective ethnic or religious groups, traces back to the Revolutionary era and its idea of a single, indivisible French nation united by shared civil rights and duties, regardless of origin. A concept strikingly different from the model adopted in a number of other Western democracies of officially recognizing and tracking distinct ethnic minorities. Certain municipalities and research institutes occasionally try to work around the direct legal ban by using indirect sociological indicators instead of direct ethnic categories, including a person's or their parents' country of birth, to at least roughly gauge the scale of migration processes and related social phenomena without formally violating the principle of Republican universalism. The word race itself was only officially removed from the text of the French Constitution relatively recently, after years of public debate over whether the mere presence of that term in the country's fundamental law, even in the context of a formal ban on discrimination, was appropriate for a state that, as a matter of principle, rejects any official categorization of citizens by race. We've covered identity and symbols. On to the events that forged that identity: the Revolution and the Napoleonic era.
Myth number 24. Queen Marie Antoinette, upon learning the people had no bread, said the famous line and instances of personal charitable donation, making the famous line an example of posthumous propaganda rather than a documented historical fact. The phrase most likely originally described a much earlier practice by French authorities of distributing more expensive, enriched bread to commoners during periods when ordinary cheap bread temporarily ran out at market, rather than being specifically invented as an insult aimed at Marie Antoinette. Similar legends about arrogant, out-of-touch words from monarchs during times of popular hardship appear in European folklore across different countries and eras, long before the French Revolution itself, making the cake story more of a recurring literary trope that happened to attach itself to one specific historical figure than a documented quote. The Queen's extremely unpopular image among her contemporaries also had fairly down-to-earth causes: her foreign, Austrian origin amid rising anti-Austrian sentiment at the French court, plus enormous personal spending on fashion, gambling, and renovating her own residences, which revolutionary propaganda later skillfully used to build a far more cartoonish, simplified image of a careless, out-of-touch monarch. During her lifetime, the Queen earned the biting French nickname Madame Deficit for exactly this kind of spending, which coincided with a period of serious strain on the state treasury, though modern historians point out that the lion's share of the era's real national debt actually came not from the Queen's personal expenses, but from far bigger budget items, including France's costly support for the American War of Independence. Myth number 25. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, was the storming of an overcrowded prison that freed large numbers of political prisoners. At the time of the storming, the Bastille held only 7 prisoners, none of them of any significant political status. The severed head of the fortress's commander, Delaunay, who surrendered to the rebels and was torn apart by the mob anyway, was paraded through the streets of Paris on a pike. The stones of the demolished fortress were later used to build one of Paris's bridges.
It's also worth noting that the July 14th national holiday officially commemorates not so much the 1789 storming itself as the Fête de la Fédération, a celebration of national unity held a year later. Among the 7 prisoners in the Bastille at the time of the storming were 4 counterfeiters, 2 mentally ill men, and 1 aristocrat imprisoned at his own family's request for scandalous behavior. A lineup starkly different from the heroic image of political prisoners fighting for freedom the fortress's storming came to be remembered for, thanks to later revolutionary propaganda. The fortress itself had, by the time of the storming, already long been slated for demolition by the authorities as an outdated, largely useless fortification, which is why it held only a minimal garrison inside, and the symbolic impact of its capture by the revolutionary crowd turned out to be far greater than the site's actual military or prison significance. The massive surviving key to the Bastille's main gate was later given as a gift to American President George Washington, symbolizing the connection between the 2 revolutions on either side of the Atlantic. And today that key is kept at his country estate in Virginia, a rare case of a physical artifact of French revolutionary history ending up permanently on display in an entirely different country. By the time of the storming, the Bastille served more as a state prison for a narrow circle of privileged prisoners held there on the king's personal order without trial than as a place of mass incarceration for ordinary criminals, which makes the fortress a far more accurate symbol of absolute monarchical arbitrariness than of the era's ordinary criminal justice system. Myth number 26. After the monarchy fell in the Revolution, France never again returned to the rule of one person with near unlimited power. Over the following century, the country went through at least 7 changes of political regime. Napoleon's proclamation as emperor in 1804, the Bourbon Restoration, the July Monarchy, the Second Republic, Napoleon III's Second Empire, and only then a stable republican form of government. The current Fifth Republic was established in 1958 by General de Gaulle as a way to finally end this chronic political instability.
Though the constitutional reform was originally conceived as a temporary solution to the Algerian crisis, not a permanent state structure meant to last for decades. Each of these regime changes also came with its own wave of political exiles fleeing the new government's persecution. First, aristocrats during the Revolution, then supporters of the empire during the Bourbon Restoration, then committed republicans during the monarchy's next return, making the history of 19th century French political emigration almost a mirror image of every successive shift of power in Paris itself. The average lifespan of any given political regime during this turbulent stretch of history often didn't exceed 15 to 20 years, an extremely unstable pace of changing state structure, by historical standards, for a modern state with pretensions to being a leading European power. Interestingly, even the state's own symbols, including the anthem and flag, kept returning and getting banned again during this turbulent period, depending on the ideological leaning of whichever government was in charge,
making the history of French state symbols we covered earlier a direct reflection of this broader 19th century political turbulence. Today's Fifth Republic has already outlasted in duration practically all the regimes that preceded it in the 19th and first half of the 20th century combined, making the current French constitutional system, contrary to the popular image of an eternally politically turbulent country, one of the most durable forms of government in modern French history. Myth number 27. The guillotine was invented by a doctor named Guillotin, seeking to create a more humane method of execution. Devices for rapid beheading existed in various parts of Europe long before the French Revolution. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin merely pushed the National Assembly persistently to adopt a single, as painless as possible, method of execution for all social classes, replacing the previously more agonizing and class-differentiated methods. The device ended up bearing the doctor's name against his own wishes, and his descendants later had to formally petition to change their own surname to escape the unwanted association with an execution device. The design itself served a very specific Enlightenment-era humanist goal, ensuring equality before capital punishment for people of all social classes. Since, before the Revolution, aristocrats were executed by a relatively quick and, by the standards of the era, dignified sword, while commoners often faced far more agonizing, drawn-out methods. And the new device was meant to eliminate that class inequality, even in the face of death. The guillotine actually remained in official use in France much longer than commonly assumed, right up until the last decades of the 20th century, which makes the device's real history far longer than it's usually mentally associated with, namely, just the era of the Revolutionary Terror in the late 18th century. The profession of state executioner in France was, for many generations, often passed down within the same families, some of whose members became well-known and, in their own way, respected figures within their narrow professional circle. And the last of these hereditary executioners left behind detailed memoirs about his own work after retiring, which became a valuable historical source for later researchers of the death penalty in France. Public debate over abolishing the death penalty in France actually began many decades before its real legislative ban, and prominent French writers and philosophers, including Victor Hugo himself, publicly spoke out against the very principle of state-sanctioned execution as early as the 19th century, which makes the eventual abolition more the result of a long, gradual shift in public attitudes than a sudden decision by a single government. Myth number 28. Napoleon Bonaparte was an unusually short man, and that's where the term Napoleon complex comes from. According to surviving medical records, Napoleon's height was about 5'5", a perfectly ordinary figure for a man of his era, not the dwarfish stature commonly assumed. The myth of the French emperor's tiny stature took hold largely thanks to propaganda cartoons by British artist James Gillray, who deliberately depicted Napoleon as miniature and petulant to mock what the British saw as his outsized ambition. Additional confusion around the emperor's height came from the difference between the French and English inch measurement systems in use at the time. The figure recorded by French doctors examining Napoleon's body after death can yield noticeably different final numbers in modern centimeters depending on which historical measurement system is used for the conversion, adding extra grounds for later speculation and disagreement over what should have been a simple biographical fact. It's also telling that practically all of Napoleon's closest marshals and confidants were of perfectly ordinary or even above average height, which makes the theory of some compensatory short man's complex as the main driving force behind his military ambitions a fairly weak psychological speculation, reflecting later pop psychology more than any real historical evidence about the emperor's character and motivations. The nickname the Little Corporal, which soldiers really did affectionately call Napoleon, actually had nothing to do with his physical height originally. It reflected his comparatively low military rank at the time of his first major successes, and a pointedly plain, aristocratic, pomp-free style of conduct among his own soldiers, which over time got mistakenly conflated in the popular imagination with the later caricatures specifically about his physical size. Myth number 29. Closing the block on the Revolution and Napoleon. The Napoleonic Code is an outdated legal document, long since stripped of any real significance. The code, adopted in 1804, remains the foundation of civil law, not just in France, but in dozens of other countries around the world, regularly amended and revised for more than 2 centuries, especially regarding women's rights provisions, which were originally far more conservative by today's standards. Napoleon himself, while in exile, called creating this body of law not his own military victory, the main achievement of his life. One, he said, would outlive the memory of all his battles. Work on the code proceeded at an unusually fast pace for a legislative project of this scale. The core body of civil law provisions was drafted by a special commission in just a few months of intensive work, and Napoleon himself, by contemporaries' accounts, personally and quite actively took part in the commission's sessions, at times showing a meticulousness surprising for a military man when it came to purely legal terminology and wording.
The code's influence on other countries' legal systems spread well beyond territories that had ever been under direct French military control, including states in Latin America and the Middle East, whose lawmakers later deliberately borrowed the structure and logic of French civil law when drafting their own national legislation. One of the code's foundational principles, establishing equal inheritance rights among all children regardless of gender or birth order, replacing the previous system of primogeniture that passed nearly all property exclusively to the eldest son, later had a noticeable effect on the structure of land ownership within France itself, as large ancestral estates grew increasingly fragmented among multiple heirs with each passing generation. The code was also the first in European legal practice to consistently establish the principle of secular civil marriage, separate from church weddings and conducted exclusively at government offices, and introduced a divorce by mutual consent procedure, a provision the subsequent conservative monarchist restoration temporarily abolished before divorce was finally and permanently restored to French law much later. We've covered Napoleon and the Revolution. One block left. How France lives and works today, from the work week to its national psychological quirks. Myth number 30. The French are known for innate rudeness and a demonstrative disregard for foreigners. A large share of this stereotype, based on traveler surveys, actually forms specifically from impressions of Paris, a major tourist megacity with the kind of local resident fatigue from a constant flow of visitors typical of any city like it. While in less touristy regions of the country, travelers generally report far warmer treatment from locals. The French custom of always saying bonjour out loud upon entering any shop is seen by the French
themselves as a basic act of elementary politeness, and its absence from a foreigner can, conversely, come across to a local shopkeeper as a sign of disrespect, a mutual cultural misunderstanding, not one-sided disdain. International country reputation surveys, meanwhile, paint a fairly contradictory picture. Alongside tourists' service complaints, France consistently ranks near the top of various global rankings for annual foreign tourist visits, which, by itself, casts doubt on the idea of universal local disregard for visitors. It's also worth noting that complaints about rude service staff get leveled at practically any major world megacity with a comparable flow of visitors, whether it's New York, London, or Rome, and are far from a uniquely French phenomenon. An observation that, however, rarely stops the specifically French version of this stereotype from circulating in pop culture and older travel guides. Strikes and street protests, regularly covered by foreign media as one more brushstroke in the image of a conflict-prone French character, are actually a long-standing, entirely legal, institutionally established tradition of civic participation in the country's political life, one the French themselves tend to see as a source of civic pride and a hard-won freedom, rather than a sign of special national irritability, as outside observers often frame it. Myth number 31. The French are known for a careless attitude toward personal hygiene. This stereotype largely traces back to 19th century British travelers' accounts of Paris's then underdeveloped urban sewer system, which genuinely lagged in sanitation standards behind the rapidly modernizing London of that period. An outdated historical observation that later hardened in the neighboring country's popular imagination into a supposedly timeless national trait. Yet France remains a world leader in the perfume and cosmetics industry.
Major global fashion and beauty conglomerates, including LVMH and L'Oreal, are based here.
And the art of fragrance making in the southern town of Grasse is officially recognized by UNESCO as part of humanity's intangible cultural heritage. It's also telling that French law includes fairly strict mandatory water quality control standards for the municipal water supply system, with regular, highly detailed public reports on inspection results available to any interested resident. A form of state oversight an outside observer under the sway of the unclean French stereotype would hardly suspect exists. Popular notions of personal hygiene and tidiness also vary noticeably from culture to culture. Some of the practices past centuries foreign observers saw as a sign of slovenliness were, in reality, simply different, unfamiliar to the visitor everyday customs, reflecting the local logic of climate, available resources, and daily life, rather than some objective, universal standard of cleanliness applicable to every culture.
Myth number 32. All French workers are legally capped at 35 hours a week with no exceptions. The famous 35-hour workweek law, passed in the late 1990s, actually includes a whole range of exceptions in practice for company executives, self-employed workers, and a number of professions whose real workload often significantly exceeds the formally established limit. The law was originally conceived primarily as a tool against unemployment. Shortening the standard work week was theoretically meant to force employers to hire additional staff. Subsequent governments have repeatedly amended it, allowing companies, by agreement with unions, to partially deviate from the strict limit by accumulating additional time off instead. Later governments' attempts to fully repeal or significantly weaken the 35-hour standard have consistently run into mass union protests, which see the shortened week not just as an economic measure, but as one of the fundamental social gains of the French labor movement, one whose repeal would symbolically mean a defeat for the whole movement.
France also remains a country with one of the longest paid annual vacation allotments in Europe, at least 5 weeks by law, which, combined with the shorter work week, is often grouped by foreign commentators as a symbol of a particularly French approach to work-life balance. It's also worth noting that French labor law has, in recent years, additionally established a so-called right to disconnect, formally freeing employees at a number of large companies from any obligation to respond to work emails and calls outside official working hours, a direct legislative response to the growing worldwide problem of employees remaining constantly digitally reachable even during vacation or after the official workday ends.
Myth number 33. The so-called French paradox, low rates of cardiovascular disease despite a traditionally rich diet and plenty of wine, has long been reliably explained by science and remains an unchanging fact. The term itself was coined by an Irish researcher in the late 1980s, and subsequent scientific work has repeatedly pointed to methodological weaknesses in the original observations and a possible statistical lag in the effect. Meanwhile, obesity rates in France have been rising noticeably in recent decades, especially among young people, which is why the French government runs active nutritional education campaigns. And the tradition of a proper hot lunch in school cafeterias survives as one tool of this policy. Among the alternative scientific explanations for the phenomenon, researchers often point not so much to red wine itself, initially credited with the main protective role, as to the generally more traditional overall diet structure, with fewer processed foods and the characteristic habit of eating smaller portions across several distinct meals throughout the day, rather than snacking on the go between tasks, as happens more often in some other Western countries. Mandatory warning labels about the dangers of excessive alcohol consumption, including a separate warning for pregnant women, are today required by law on every alcoholic beverage label sold in French stores, regardless of the drink's reputation as part of national culinary tradition. The French healthcare system also systematically funds large-scale, long-term epidemiological studies of the population's own diet, whose results are regularly used both by the international scientific community and by French officials themselves to adjust official healthy eating recommendations, making the French paradox less a settled conclusion than a living, constantly refined area of research. The idea of red wine's protective properties, at one point, gained such broad and not always critically examined traction in Western media that it led to a noticeable, though temporary, spike in red wine sales in the United States shortly after a television report on the subject aired. A telling example of how a single piece of popular science coverage of a debatable hypothesis can directly shape an entire country's consumer behavior. Myth number 34. The culture shock foreign tourists experience colliding with the real Paris is a purely fictional, exaggerated media phenomenon. Paris syndrome, a psychological state of acute disappointment and disorientation observed mainly in Japanese tourists whose expectations of Paris are shaped by an idealized, romanticized image of the city in pop culture, is officially recognized and described in psychiatric literature, and the Japanese embassy in Paris maintains a dedicated, round-the-clock hotline for citizens
experiencing it. The real number of documented cases, though, runs to just a few dozen a year, against the backdrop of millions of Japanese tourists visiting Paris annually. And among the recorded symptoms, doctors note not just anxiety, but sometimes genuinely physical manifestations like dizziness and a racing heartbeat. The first systematic scientific descriptions of this condition appeared in psychiatric literature back in the late 1980s, thanks to the observations of a French-Japanese psychiatrist who practiced for years in Paris and noticed a recurring pattern among his Japanese patients' complaints. Most documented cases, though, resolve within a matter of days with simple rest and a change of scenery, and doctors tend to classify only isolated episodes as genuinely severe forms requiring hospitalization, which makes this fairly high-profile media story more of a statistically rare curiosity against the backdrop of the overwhelmingly positive experience of tourist trips in general. It's also telling that researchers document similar, though not formally classified as a separate clinical diagnosis, forms of tourist disappointment in relation to other destinations famous for their romanticized reputation too. Which raises the question of whether Paris syndrome is really just the most vividly documented specific case of a far more universal psychological mechanism. Expectations shaped by pop culture colliding with a far more prosaic, everyday reality. And the last, 35th myth, the one that brings us back to the story we started with. It's often assumed that France's great symbols, like the Statue of Liberty, were born as a single, fully thought-through creative vision from one brilliant author from start to finish. In reality, as we now know, that same Bartholdi first pitched an almost identical statue in scale and silhouette to Egypt as a lighthouse at the entrance to the Suez Canal. And it was only Khedive Ismail Pasha's refusal that redirected the sculptor's vision toward the Atlantic. Tellingly, the figure conceived for Egypt was meant to depict a veiled Eastern peasant woman holding a lamp, while in the American version, that same raised arm with a torch turned into an attribute of a goddess of liberty, dressed in classical robes, in the spirit of the European Enlightenment. The same original silhouette taking on a completely different symbolic meaning depending on which country and which political idea it ultimately ended up serving. That's probably the best metaphor for the whole history of France we've covered today. The same facts: revolution, Napoleon, the guillotine, the croissant, a statue with a torch, turn into completely different stories depending on who's retelling them and for what purpose. And the only way to tell the genuine history from a good-looking legend is, as we just did, to take it myth by myth and see what's left of each one on closer inspection. Khedive Ismail Pasha himself, who declined to fund the Egyptian version of the statue at the time, could hardly have guessed that less than half a century later, a similarly shaped monument would become one of the most recognizable symbols of an entire country on another continent. A small reminder that the history of cultural symbols rarely follows their creator's original intentions, and far more often comes together out of chance rejections, second attempts, and lucky timing than any linear, pre-planned path to world fame. If you think about it,
Almost every one of the 35 myths we've covered today follows the same hidden logic. The convenient, emotionally vivid version of an event almost always crowds out the more boring but far more accurate documented truth from popular memory. Whether it's a line falsely attributed to a queen, the actual makeup of the Bastille's prisoners, the croissant's real origin, or the fate of a rejected Egyptian statue.